Welcome, friends. This is the Before You Read lecture for the latter part of the Gospel of Mark, Mark chapters 11 through 16. We can describe this or talk about this as Jesus in Jerusalem. You may remember that up to this point, in the first 10 chapters of the Gospel of Mark, Jesus has really been active in the region north of Jerusalem in the Galilee. He's been teaching and he's been healing. But generally, he's been in Galilee, according to the Gospel of Mark, and it is only in chapter 11 that he makes his entry into Jerusalem. For the Gospel of Mark, this entry into Jerusalem is the beginning of the end. It really is a tragic entry in some ways, insofar as it leads to his death, insofar as it leads to his betrayal and his trial. We see the first moments in Jerusalem are apparently times of celebration. The triumphal entry, you may remember, is the way in which the Gospel of Mark portrays Jesus' first entry into Jerusalem. This celebration, this crying out of Hosanna, leads almost immediately to Jesus' conflict with the temple, or with the temple authorities. Scholars often refer to this as the temple incident. And there is a good bit of interpretive difference among the significance of this event, especially as it relates to the cause of Jesus' death. Many New Testament scholars have suggested that it was Jesus' action, his violent action, his subversive action in the temple that actually led to his crucifixion. It's what started the ball rolling, if you will. While Jesus is in Jerusalem, he continues to teach. And if we were to distinguish a different tone to the teaching, it might be that it is more challenging. It's more about controversies. Of course, these occur earlier in the Gospel of Mark, but it seems as though Jesus' authority is challenged. Rival Jewish groups are trying to see where Jesus fits within the larger Jewish landscape. So pay attention to the ways in which Jesus is teaching and what he's teaching. Chapter 13 is a doozy. Just going to warn you, it is an important and difficult passage, not only because of what it says, but because of the variety of ways it has been interpreted. Scholars refer to it as the synoptic apocalypse or as the eschatological discourse. And here Jesus seems to be making predictions about the destruction of the temple and even the destruction of Jerusalem. In so doing, he's not unlike the prophets of the Old Testament who also prophesied and predicted the coming destruction of Jerusalem and its temple. Jesus, or this section of Mark, also draws on some stock images and imagery from apocalyptic literature that we know of from ancient Judaism. But there's also some reflections or potential reflections of the lived experience of the first hearers of Mark's gospel. It seems as though their experiences in the 60s are being refracted or remembered or inserted into the story of Jesus. And so it leaves us with a number of questions. The degree to which we should read this as a sort of astrology report or a prediction of the way things are going to be at the end of ages, or the way things are going to be at the end of Jerusalem's standing. Is it a matter of the earliest readers and hearers of Mark's gospel processing their own experience with the events that were happening around them in their time, some 30 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus? And is it an exhortation to be a waiting community? So I invite you to read chapter 13 slowly Ask your questions, put your question marks in the margin, use any study notes that you have, and I hope that we can talk about it more, but it is a confounding part of Mark's gospel. The last three chapters, 14, 15, and 16, we could describe as the Passion narrative. These are the chapters really devoted to the final 24 or 36 hours in the life of Jesus. And the really interesting part about the Passion narrative is that there is a significant degree of correspondence between all four New Testament Gospels, and the first three Gospels, known as the Synoptic Gospels, display some of the tightest connections among any parts of those three Gospels. And so the fact that this tradition seems so tight and so formed in these various Gospels has led scholars to think that this might have been the earliest traditions about the life of Jesus, that the first memories of Jesus were those about his passion, his final meal with his disciples, his arrest and betrayal, and his resurrection. So it's an important piece that we see in all of the Gospels and in a striking set of correspondence. We also know that our earliest tradition, Paul's letters that are written some 15 or so years before the Gospels, are also most familiar with this Passion narrative tradition. They demonstrate, for example, in 1 Corinthians 15, a familiarity with this last few days of Jesus' life and less of an interest or an awareness of his earlier life. The final thing to point out is the last chapter of the Gospel of Mark. There, if you are reading from a study Bible, you will notice that there are different endings to the Gospel of Mark. There are at least two different endings in different manuscript traditions, but our best manuscript traditions suggest that the ending is in 16:8, that the original ending is in Mark 16:8. And if you read up to Mark 16:8 and you stop, you're left with a rather unsatisfactory ending, or at least an ending that leaves a lot of questions unanswered. And so that has led scholars to regard the subsequent verses as later additions meant to resolve some of that tension, some of those questions, some of those uncertainties. So we'll talk about the endings of the Gospel of Mark, as well as why reading 16:8 as the actual ending of the Gospel makes sense. But I invite you to read those other endings and see what you think of them. In conclusion, read this final part of Mark being aware of where the narrative of Jesus and the narrative of the community may be overlapping. Always ask the question, who gets Jesus, who perceives Jesus, and who doesn't? Wrestle with the degree to which the story of Mark's gospel and the story of the disciples in Mark's gospel is one of failure. And where do you see aspects or glimmers of hope? And then finally, Paul in his letter to the Corinthians says that the message of the cross, the logos of the cross, the story of the cross, the good news that Christians proclaim, we might say, is a stumbling block, and it's foolishness. And so think of Mark's ending and the degree to which it is a scandalous, foolish, stumbling block type of message. Lots to chew on in the Gospel of Mark, lots to talk about. I look forward to hearing your thoughts as well. Thank you.